Okay. Well, welcome again. And it's getting cold here. We're having some cold weather in Florida, so I grabbed one of my long coats from the closet. I have several of these that I've made. Um, so supposed to get snow in the next couple days, and I don't know if that'll happen or not. It's been over 30 years since I've seen snow there. So anyway, I wanted to talk about Fort McNeil and Fort Taylor. Unfortunately, there's not a lot to say about them. There's no post returns. There's no post returns on Fort Christmas either. So they must be combined in one of the other post returns. And but more about that in a minute. Let's explain where these forts are. This is Major General Thomas Sidney Jessup. He actually has a house you can visit in Louisville, Kentucky, known as Locust Grove. And in fact, his house is right near Zachary Taylor's house. Zachary Taylor's house is still in private hands there. You can visit Locust Grove. It's like a historic site that you can visit today. Jesup, uh, he was Army Quartermaster General longer than anyone else, over 40 years, from 1818 to 1861. He was, I think, is the 25th Infantry in the War of 1812 at the Battle of Lundy's Lane, which was the most costly battle um, that the American Army fought in the War of 1812. It's on the Canada side. The Canadians consider it a victory. The Americans say it was a victory because they gained the ground, nearly wiped out the whole top officers in the U.S. Army during that battle. In fact, all the major officers in the Second Seminole War, Winfield Scott, William Jenkins Worth, Thomas Sidney Jessup, they were all there and they all got injured, suffered injuries for the rest of his life. General Winfield Scott, his shoulder was shattered uh, there by I think, a cannon shot. Um, Amazing that he survived. Um, William Jenkins Worth, he was, I think, shot in the thighs, knocked off a horse. And General Thomas Sidney Jessup, he had a finger blown off at the battle, and that's probably why he's covering his hand. So when you get injured in the Army, they put you in the administrative area as quartermaster, and that was kind of really smart on their end because General Jessup was a very good quartermaster and very good supplies, and he actually turned the Second Seminole War around when the U.S. was losing at that point. And so he understood that the Army needs to be supplied and fed. So he started to supply the Army and make sure everything is pushed through. With Jessup on this campaign is the Second Dragoons. Second Dragoons were the elite corps of the Army created in 1836. Everybody wanted to be in the Dragoons and ride the horse instead of walk as infantry. At this time, the uniform of the Dragoons, and this is the dress uniform with the shako, uh, instead of a light blue jacket, they had a dark blue jacket. And at this point, it's supposed to have orange facings. Uh, Later on, the Dragoons became the Second Cavalry, and they changed to gold facings at that point. That's, I think, in the late 1840s, early 1850s. The artillery during the 1830s, and this was just a brief period of history, the artillery was gold at this point. That's why the Dragoons were orange, and the artillery would change to red or crimson. And so ever since that time, the cavalry or dragoons has been gold and the artillery's been red. So this from the congressional papers, he can read a little better. Wherever General Jessup is the headquarters of the Army. So unusual right now, the headquarters of the Army is 6 miles north of Fort McNeil. Most of these forts, on the Upper St. John's were pretty much like we see at Fort Christmas, which I showed in my last video. A square picket fort with blockhouses on adjacent angles. And it seems to be that was kind of consistent with what they looked like. Here's from the Mackay-Blake map, the area of operation. Uh, General Jesup, he's coming down the St. John's. And at one point, he's going to hook up with the East Coast. General Taylor is going down the center of the state, which results in the Battle of Okeechobee. And then I think it's Colonel Percifer Smith from New Orleans. He's on the West Coast or Southwest Florida. If you go look on Lake Monroe, you have Fort Mellon, established in February 1837. And at that point, the Army wasn't sure the course of the St. John's. There's many tributaries and streams that run into the St. John's. It becomes just a general water and much flooded much of this time. And so finally, they find the path, discover Lake Jesup, and go on to Lake Harney. They establish Fort Lane at Lake Harney. Fort Lane will become the major depot for the campaign south along the St. John's, and that will just last, a couple weeks. Further down is Fort Christmas, which I also did a video on previous. They notice they build a road paralleling the upper St. Johns River. They get to Fort McNeil. Oh, zoom in here. Fort McNeil on Hatchelesty Creek, not far from Lake Poinsett. And further down on, actually, Fort McNeil, it used to have a historical marker. And I remember seeing that as a kid when my scout troop was going to a camporee on the Desiree Ranch. We'd pass by the historical marker. And I haven't seen it for several years. So I just saw in a historical article that was taken down because they're afraid of people shooting at it, which is a shame. And of course, they took it down and nobody's seen it since. Fort McNeil is named after Lieutenant John Winfield Scott McNeil, killed at the Battle of Mosquito Inlet. He was a nephew of President Franklin Pierce, also nephew of Colonel Benjamin Pierce, that Fort Pierce is named after. And then further down is Fort Taylor on Lake Winder. And that's a fort there. There's like an Indian mound that they would use the mound for observation and signaling. Going down the St. John's and the East Coast, Jesup employed as many steamboats and that he could get a hold of, bringing supplies up and down the rivers. This a drawing from Captain John Rogers Vinton. He was stationed at New Smyrna, and the Seminole Wars Foundation sells his journal that's been published. And of course, the Army hit the East Coast and further down and went down the Indian River to St. Lucie, then down to Jupiter, where Lieutenant Powell had a combined Army-Navy force. Lieutenant Powell of the Navy took some boats in hunting for the Seminoles, and the Seminoles found him instead and nearly wiped him out. Jesup brought his main force down and fought the Battle of Loxahatchee 10 days later. So you have the Battle of Lieutenant Powell in January 15th, 1838, and General Jesup on January 24th, 1838. And of course, the Seminoles at that point got away. Jesup says he won because he got the ground, but the Seminoles accomplished what they needed to evacuate their villages. And it would be a guerrilla warfare for the next 4 years with not as large battles, but certainly some significant battles after that, which I've wrote about in my book, Alachua Ambush. So, the at that point, the Army would be continuing trying to catch the Seminoles in the Everglades. And so let's look at a map and see where Jesup's campaign goes. This is a map from the Florida State Library on their card catalog. This is, if I can just shrink it up a minute, this is a map of the seat of war of Florida. Um, oh, wrong way. Okay. A map of the seat of war of Florida during the winter of 1837, 1838 to accompany the report of General Jesup, a report he made to Congress. In fact, next video, I'll read from Jesup's journal on a bit, but let's focus on Jesup's campaign. He started three columns moving south in the peninsula. You have General Jesup on the down the St. Johns River. He puts the Florida militia on the East Coast under command of General Hernandez. You have Colonel Zachary Taylor going down the center of the state, the Kissimmee River, which turns into the Battle of Lake Okeechobee on Christmas Day. And there's a little place on here where they show the battle. And you have the Western Column moving out of Fort Brooke into Charlotte Harbor, and that's under the command of Colonel Percifer Smith, who headed the Louisiana Volunteers. So you can see down here, down the Upper St. Johns, Fort Wayne, Fort Christmas, Fort McNeil, and Fort Taylor, and past Fort Taylor and Lake Winder, the Upper St. Johns just becomes a little uh, indescript and just hard to follow, very shallow. They can't really bring any deep draft boats. All the boats are shallow draft. Jesup's writing his letters saying from the headwaters of St. John's. I don't know if he means at Fort Taylor at this point or this other kind of wet area. In fact, on another map, it's this area is called the Big Cypress, or Cypress area. And then you see on the map there's this line colored in. I think that's where the Army must have crossed over to Fort Pierce at that point. Fort Pierce, a little different configuration, more of a trapezoid feature. I was looking for I had a kind of a drawing or a sketch, and I couldn't find it, but Fort Pierce is a kind of a trapezoid shaped fort. It has three sides, and the fourth side is on the water side on the inlet, so there's no picket wall on the water side. So after Jessup brought the supplies down there, had such a problem doing that that he decided that the main campaign is going to be down the East Coast. So he has all the boats he can employed down the East Coast. You can see it come in at Mosquito Inlet and Mosquito Lagoon. They'd cross over at Haulover, where Fort Ann is, where General Hernandez built Fort Ann. Haulover was a sandbar. They'd drag the boats over to Indian River. And once in Indian River, the water's kind of much calmer and safe. They'd come down here in Indian River Inlet. Near there, they established Fort Pierce, which became the city of Fort Pierce. And further down, they have the St. Lucie River. There, Jessup wanted a post established there, and this became the main supply post after abandoning the campaign on the St. John's. And from there, Jessup had the Battle of Waxahachie, or the two battles in January. And so I'm going to cut it off here. Next video, I'm going to go over General Jessup's journal, uh, letters that he wrote and sent out from December 30th, 1837 until January 14th, 1838, the day before Lieutenant Powell's battle with the battle on the Jupiter River. And so that'll take a while to read over. So I figure I'll cut it off here, make it two videos instead. And as I try to stay warm in my long coat. But hope you enjoy that explanation of General's battle leading up to the Battle of Loxahatchee. And I'll get in some of the details and read some of the interesting supplies, like the tens of thousands of musket cartridges that he orders. But more of that later on.